There was one thing that appeared in backpacks, field hospitals, trenches, command posts, and even in the final moments before soldiers charged toward death. It could warm the body in freezing cold. It could make a soldier's hands stop shaking when artillery exploded beside him. It could be used to disinfect wounds, dull pain, and calm the nerves. But it also once left commanders drunk behind the front line, ruined entire attacks, and sent thousands of soldiers into disaster. That thing was alcohol. In war, alcohol was never just a drink. It was a sedative, a reward, a ritual, a tool for controlling morale, a false source of courage, and sometimes an extremely dangerous double-edged sword. When war pushed human beings into the harshest conditions imaginable, alcohol often became one of the few remaining sources of comfort. Physiologically, it gave the body a feeling of warmth. It eased exhaustion. It made soldiers feel stronger, braver, and more capable of enduring pain. Psychologically, it could help men gather courage before battle, suppress fear after the roar of artillery, or calm panic after watching comrades fall. Culturally, alcohol appeared in victory celebrations, memorial rituals, farewells, and those quiet moments when soldiers raised a cup to remember the dead and remind themselves that they were still alive. But alcohol also brought countless problems to armies: drunkenness, violence, loss of control, weakened discipline, addiction, command failures, and social wounds that lasted long after the war ended. That is why, throughout military history, alcohol has always been something battlefield managers both needed and feared. They wanted to use it to sustain morale, but they also had to guard against its power to damage the very army they were trying to command. And in every major war, each nation left behind its own way of using this soft weapon, useful, comforting, and dangerous all at once. If we had to choose one of the most important chapters in the wartime history of alcohol in America, it would probably be the American Civil War. From a broad historical perspective, this was the period when Rome, once deeply loved by Americans, began to decline, while bourbon whiskey, a flavor that felt far more distinctly American, began to rise. But if we look directly at the war itself, the Union and the Confederacy treated alcohol in very different ways. On the Union side, thanks to stronger industry and a more complete logistics system, the North actually had the ability to include alcohol in regular military supplies. But because commanders feared the consequences of drunkenness, they adopted a rather subtle policy, strict in discipline but flexible in practice. At the official level, hard liquor was never formally included in regular rations. Soldiers were even told that they were not allowed to buy alcohol privately. But when nerves needed to be relaxed, fatigue needed to be eased, cold had to be endured, or some special situation had to be handled, a small daily amount of special whiskey was often a benefit that many Union officers could secure for their men. In medical use, the Union Army also widely used hard liquor for pain relief, sedation, disinfection, and other emergency needs. So although alcohol was not openly treated as an official ration, it still existed in the Army in a special form, part medicine, part reward, part morale tool, and part flexible supply controlled at the lower levels. In other words, the Union did not completely ban alcohol. It tried to control it, turned it into part of a system of reward, punishment, and psychological regulation. The Confederacy was different. Its army was largely made up of young white men from small farming families and plantation backgrounds. In terms of drinking habits, they may have been no weaker than Union soldiers, perhaps even stronger. But the problem was that the South lacked the industrial base needed to produce alcohol on a large scale. Apart from a few small workshops, the South had very few major distilleries worth mentioning. Consumption was high, but production was low. So after the war began, the Confederate side, despite having many men who loved to drink, became the side that imposed stronger restrictions on alcohol sales earlier and more widely. Take Richmond, the Confederate capital, as an example. The military order at the time was very strict. Except for drugstores, no place was allowed to sell hard liquor. Prohibition rarely makes desire disappear. It usually pushes desire into the black market. As a result, illegal alcohol trading exploded. Before the war, a gallon of whiskey might cost only about 25 cents. By 1864, its price had been driven up to $40, an astonishing increase. If we summarize the alcohol policies of both sides in the Civil War, we could say this. The North controlled alcohol strictly, but left room for practical use. The South banned it harshly, but created a thriving black market. And if we ask when alcohol directly caused one of the greatest disasters on the Civil War battlefield, the answer would be the Battle of the Crater during the Siege of Petersburg in 1864. At that time, both sides were led by famous military figures. On the Confederate side stood General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army, a West Point graduate known for his outstanding academic record. Under him was the Army of Northern Virginia, one of the most elite forces of the Confederacy. On the Union side was General George Meade, the man who had faced Lee at Gettysburg and won a crucial victory. Under his command was the Army of the Potomac, one of the most famous and most criticized armies in American military history. The background of the battle was the Union Siege of Petersburg. To break the deadlock, Union forces used a special tactic. They dug a tunnel beneath the Confederate line and planted explosives. At dawn on July 30th, 1864, Union troops detonated around 4 tons of gunpowder buried under the Confederate position. The explosion was terrifying. It created a massive crater on the battlefield, more than 40 meters wide, and instantly killed 278 Confederate soldiers. The Confederate troops fell into panic. The chance for a Union breakthrough seemed to have opened. According to the plan, the attacking Union troops were supposed to go around the crater and seize the disrupted Confederate position. But in reality, the assault force became confused by the chaos. Instead of moving around the crater, many soldiers rushed straight into the giant hole created by their own explosion. That mistake was fatal. Once the Confederates regained their senses, they counterattacked. The Union soldiers trapped inside the crater became almost perfect targets. A chance to break through quickly turned into a massacre. After the disastrous battle, President Abraham Lincoln ordered an investigation. The inquiry found that one of the key reasons the Union lost its opportunity was General James Ledlie, the man who was supposed to lead the assault after the explosion. Ledlie had originally been trained as a civil engineer, but when the explosion happened, he did not personally lead his troops forward, nor did he seriously command the operation. Instead, he stayed behind the lines, drinking rum. Only about 10 minutes after the explosion did Ledlie emerge from cover, already drunk. During the following command process, he repeatedly made poor judgments, ultimately leading his men straight into the center of the crater. As a result, 3,798 Union soldiers became casualties. That battle became known as the Battle of the Crater. It remains a chilling example of alcohol's dark side on the battlefield. A little alcohol could calm a soldier's nerves, but in the hands of a commander at a decisive moment, it could turn a chance for victory into disaster. If the American Civil War was the story of how North and South handled alcohol in a fratricidal conflict, then half a century later, World War I turned alcohol in the military into a global stage. Each of the great powers had its own way of bringing alcohol into soldiers' lives. Among them, the most traditional was probably Britain. In 1740, Admiral Edward Vernon of the Royal Navy ordered watered-down rum to be issued to sailors. From that point on, the British military's attitude toward alcohol was much like the Empire's general style: cautious, restrained, old-fashioned, and somewhat conservative. By the 19th century, British hard liquor rations were gradually reduced. Eventually, they became fixed as a small ration issued around or before noon each day. Ordinary soldiers received about 1/8 of a pint of rum, roughly 71 milliliters, and most of it was diluted. Only higher-ranking non-commissioned officers had the privilege of drinking it neat. During World War I, the situation remained largely the same. One interesting detail comes from the Gallipoli campaign. After Allied forces sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the sea, fought for 11 months, suffered enormous casualties, and
finally...
And a French soldier's cup was not merely alcohol, it was wine, something French culture and the French state had almost officially accepted as a form of liquid food. For that reason, the wine ration of French soldiers during World War I did not decrease. Instead, it followed a fairly clear upward trend. At first, each soldier might receive about 0.25 liters of wine per day. Later, this increased to 0.5 liters and then to 0.75 liters. In many frontline units, soldiers could also receive about 60 milliliters of brandy per day, especially when assembling or preparing for an assault. At such moments, brandy functioned almost like a psychological stimulant, helping soldiers gather courage before walking into gunfire. On the opposite side, among the Central Powers, the German army may have had the most varied alcohol rations. Beer, wine, brandy, schnapps, they had almost everything. The Germans were even direct enough to put alcohol standards into written ration documents. When the war had just begun in 1914, the German army prepared a rather thoughtful three-option alcohol menu. Each day, soldiers could receive 500 milliliters of beer, or 250 milliliters of wine, or 150 milliliters of hard liquor.
At first glance, this seemed like a very humane policy toward soldiers, but as the war dragged on, maintaining such a standard became more and more difficult. Grain, sugar, potatoes, and other ingredients used for making alcohol became severely scarce. Domestic alcohol production in Germany began to collapse, especially during 1916 and 1917, during the so-called turnip winter, a period of desperate food shortage when many Germans had to survive on turnips and substitute foods. After World War I, humanity had just endured a war in which artillery roared day and night, mud swallowed bodies, and trenches became hell. But mankind did not seem to learn enough from it. Only a few decades later, an even more intense and wider war erupted, World War II. If we ask which country used alcohol to the extreme in this war, even tying it to national fate, the answer must be the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. For Russians, and later for Soviet citizens, vodka was never just alcohol. It was part of history, culture, finance, and national identity. From the late 14th century, when Genoese traders brought distillation technology to the Grand Duchy of Moscow, vodka gradually developed into the signature drink of this land. Through multiple distillations, people created a clear, colorless, almost odorless liquor with a pure and powerful taste. For the people of Russia, it became their favorite drink. In the late Tsarist period, after certain state monopolies were removed, the price of vodka dropped sharply. It became more common among the population, while alcohol taxes became a huge source of government revenue. At one point, alcohol tax accounted for more than 40% of state income. By the 20th century, vodka's share of alcohol consumption in Russia and the Soviet Union had reached an astonishing level, 89%. Calling vodka the national liquor was not an exaggeration. But the official introduction of vodka into the Soviet military began during the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland. That war was fought under extremely harsh conditions. Many combat areas were near the Arctic, where temperatures could fall to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Under these conditions, and following the suggestion of Clement Voroshilov, a major Soviet military figure who himself was known to enjoy drinking, the Soviet army officially added 100 grams of 40-proof vodka to the daily ration of soldiers in January 1940. This gave rise to the famous phrase, the People's Commissar's 100 grams. When the German-Soviet War broke out in 1941 and the Soviet Union faced a disastrous early crisis, Stalin expanded the use of vodka as a tool for boosting morale across the army.
On the Eastern Front, vodka served several purposes at once. It made soldiers feel more excited and energized. It seemed to make them more able to endure terrible conditions, poor treatment, and horrifying casualties. Vodka was not only for drinking. Because it was relatively free of impurities, it could also be used medically, especially for disinfection. empty vodka bottles were not wasted either. They could be collected, filled with flammable liquid, and turned into Molotov cocktails against German tanks. There were even rituals in the Red Army that carried a strong vodka identity. Some soldiers would drop a medal they had just received into a glass of vodka and then drink it down as a special ritual of honor. At that moment, alcohol was not merely a drink. It became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and comradeship. To meet the enormous demand of wartime, between 1942 and 1944, the Soviet Union urgently built 250 million liters of vodka. But the greater cost came after the war. From then on, vodka became a kind of financial valve for the Soviet state and its planned economy. The government needed the enormous tax revenue from alcohol, but also had to deal with the social consequences of widespread alcoholism. The Soviet government launched several major anti-alcohol campaigns, including campaigns in 1958 and 1972. But because the entire society had become deeply dependent on vodka, every restriction created a vacuum. The market filled that vacuum with illegal alcohol, homemade spirits, and low-quality substitutes, often causing even greater problems. The climax came with Mikhail Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign in the 1980s. It was the most aggressive campaign of its kind, but its side effects were enormous. It caused social resentment, reduced state revenue, encouraged black market activity, and pushed many people toward homemade alcohol or dangerous substitutes. Some even argue that the consequences of this campaign were connected at least in part to the economic, social, and political cracks that eventually contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. From whiskey in the American Civil War to British rum, French wine, German beer and schnapps, and Soviet vodka, every kind of alcohol reflects a different slice of wartime history.
They show us that on the battlefield, human beings did not fight only with guns, tactics, and patriotism. They also fought with very ordinary things. A sip of alcohol to keep warm, a glass of brandy before charging, a bottle of vodka to disinfect a wound, or a cup of whiskey to forget the sound of artillery for a few brief minutes. And that is why alcohol has always been such a paradoxical symbol in war. It saves people, it destroys people. It warms the soldier in the cold night, and sometimes it burns an entire chance of victory to the ground.